Choice overload. You're standing in the cereal aisle, staring at 70 different boxes. Organic. Sugar-free, fiber. Gluten-free. Kid-friendly. Every brand promising something better. 5 minutes ago, you just wanted breakfast. Now you're paralyzed, second-guessing everything, wondering if there's a better option 3 shelves down. This happens when you hit choice overload. The point where having more options doesn't give you freedom. It takes it away. We've been told that more choice equals more control. That abundance is always better. But that's not how the brain works. When you face too many options, your brain treats it like a threat. Decision-making drains mental energy. Every additional choice drains a little more. At first, it feels manageable. But as the options pile up, something shifts. The task stops feeling exciting and starts feeling exhausting. And it's not just about picking one thing. It's about rejecting everything else. The more options you reject, the more you second-guess. Did you overlook something better? Could you have chosen smarter? That uncertainty doesn't fade after you decide. It follows you. This shows up everywhere. Restaurants with 15-page menus where you spend more time deliberating than eating. Streaming platforms with thousands of titles where you scroll endlessly and watch nothing. Dating apps with infinite profiles where no one feels good enough because there's always another swipe. The illusion is that abundance creates satisfaction. The reality is that it creates anxiety. Here's the cruelest part. The more options you have, the less satisfied you feel with whatever you pick. When there are only a few options, you choose, move on, and feel fine. But when there are dozens, you can't stop wondering if you missed the better version. Even if your choice works perfectly, the nagging sense that something better existed lingers. That's why satisfaction drops. Not because the choice was bad, but because the volume of alternatives made certainty impossible. It's why people freeze. Why they defer decisions, hoping clarity will come later. Why they choose nothing at all. Not because they're indecisive by nature, but because the sheer volume of possibilities has made deciding feel impossible. Choice overload doesn't just slow you down. It rewrites how you experience freedom itself. And once that weight sets in, every decision starts to feel heavier than it should. Decision fatigue. You wake up sharp. The first decision of the day, what to wear, takes seconds. By lunch, choosing where to eat feels harder. By evening, deciding what to watch becomes a 15-minute mental negotiation. It's not that the decisions got more important. It's that your brain ran out of fuel. This is decision fatigue. The slow erosion of your ability to make good choices the more decisions you're forced to make. Every decision you make depletes a limited mental resource. Your brain treats decision-making like a muscle. The more you use it, the weaker it gets. Early in the day, when your mental energy is high, decisions feel effortless. You weigh options clearly, think rationally, and commit without hesitation. But as the day progresses and the decisions stack up, that clarity fades. What happens next is predictable. You start taking shortcuts. You go with the default option, not because it's best, but because thinking feels too expensive. You avoid decisions altogether, delaying them until they pile into an even bigger problem. Or you make impulsive choices, the kind you'd never make when you're fresh, just to get the decision over with. Judges demonstrate this perfectly. Early in the day, they carefully waive cases and grant parole at reasonable rates. But as the day wears on and they've ruled on case after case, they default to the safest, easiest option. Denial. It's not bias. It's exhaustion. The mental cost of evaluating another case becomes too high, so they stop evaluating. They just decide. It happens in relationships, too. After a long day of decisions at work, meetings, emails, the smallest question from a partner, where should we go for dinner, feels unbearable. It's not that you don't care. It's that your decision-making capacity is already spent. So you snap, defer, or shut down, not because the question is hard, but because your brain has nothing left to give. The worst part is that decision fatigue doesn't feel like fatigue. It feels like apathy, like nothing matters, like you've stopped caring about outcomes. But that's not what's happening. You still care. Your brain just can't process another choice. And here's what makes it dangerous. The decisions you make in this state don't disappear. You're still accountable for them. The impulsive purchase, the harsh reply, the choice to do nothing when action was needed. Decision fatigue doesn't erase consequences. It just makes you more likely to choose poorly. By the end of the day, you're not the same decision maker you were in the morning. And every choice you've already made ensures the next one will be worse. Sunk cost fallacy. 2 years into a relationship that stopped working 6 months ago. You know it's over. You've known for a while, but walking away feels impossible because of how much you've already put in. The time, the effort, the plans you made together. You tell yourself it'll get better, that all those months can't just disappear. So you stay not because you want to, but because leaving feels like admitting it was all a waste. This is the sunk cost fallacy. The inability to let go of something because of what you've already invested, even when continuing only makes things worse. The logic feels sound. You've spent 2 years building this relationship. Abandoning it now means those 2 years meant nothing. So you keep going, trying to salvage what's already gone, pouring more time into something that's never going to pay off. But here's what the brain refuses to accept: those 2 years are gone whether you stay or leave. The investment is already lost. Staying doesn't recover it. It just adds more loss on top. This happens because we treat past investments as reasons to continue, even when they have nothing to do with future outcomes. You've watched 4 episodes of a show you hate, so you keep watching, convinced it'll improve. You've spent hundreds on a gym membership you never use, so you renew it, telling yourself this year will be different. You've sunk money into a failing project at work, so you fight to keep it alive, hoping one more push will turn it around. None of these decisions are based on what's best moving forwards. They're based on what you've already lost. And that's the trap. The past can't be changed. The money's spent. The time's gone. The effort's done. But instead of accepting that and making the smartest choice for the future, you double down, chasing something that will never come back. It's why businesses throw good money after bad. Why people stay in careers they've outgrown. Why investors hold on to losing stocks, waiting for a recovery that never comes. The deeper the investment, the harder it is to walk away. Not because staying makes sense, but because leaving forces you to confront the loss you've been avoiding. And the cruelest part, every day you stay, the cost gets higher. You're not just holding on to what you've lost. You're losing more. The sunk cost fallacy doesn't protect your investment. It guarantees you'll waste even more before you finally let go. Loss aversion. Someone offers you a bet. Flip a coin. Heads, you win £50. Tails, you lose £50. Mathematically, it's even. Perfectly fair. But you don't take it. Not because the odds are bad, but because losing £50 feels worse than winning £50 feels good. The potential loss weighs heavier, and that imbalance shapes every decision you make, even when it works against you. This is loss aversion. The psychological reality that losses hurt roughly twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. It's not rational, but it's hardwired. Losing £20 triggers more emotional pain than gaining £20 triggers pleasure. Your brain doesn't weigh outcomes evenly. It's biased towards avoiding loss, even at the expense of potential gain. That's why people refuse fair bets. Why they hold on to investments that are clearly failing. Why they settle for less rather than risk losing what they already have. You see it everywhere. Someone gets a bonus at work but focuses on the tax deduction, not the extra money. A couple wins £200 at a casino but leaves angry because they lost 50 on the last hand. You buy concert tickets, then can't go, but refuse to sell them at a loss even though keeping them means losing the entire amount. The loss dominates. The gain barely registers. It's why people stay in bad situations longer than they should. Leaving a job, ending a friendship, moving cities, all of these involve loss. Loss of stability. Loss of familiarity. Loss of the known. Even when staying is objectively worse, the brain clings to what's already there, because losing it feels unbearable. And here's where it gets worse. Loss aversion doesn't just make you avoid risk. It makes you take bigger risks to avoid acknowledging a loss. Someone's losing money in the stock market. Instead of selling and accepting the loss, they hold on, hoping it'll recover. A gambler's down for the night. Instead of walking away, they double their bets, chasing what they've already lost. The fear of realizing the loss pushes them deeper into behavior that guarantees more loss. That's the trap. Loss aversion doesn't protect you from losing. It just makes you so afraid of loss that you end up losing more. You hold bad investments. You avoid necessary risks. You cling to situations that stopped working long ago, all because letting go feels worse than staying stuck. Losses hurt. But clinging to them doesn't make the pain go away. It just ensures you'll feel it longer. Decoy Effect. You're buying a coffee subscription. 2 options. Small, £8 a month. Large, £12 a month. You're leaning towards the small one. Then you notice a third option. Medium, £11 a month. Suddenly, the large feels like a deal. It's only £1 more than the medium, but you get more coffee. You choose large, not because you needed it, but because the medium made it look better. And that third option, it was never meant to be chosen. It was just there to push you. This is the decoy effect, a deliberately inferior option placed to make another choice look more appealing. It works because your brain doesn't evaluate choices in isolation. It compares them. And when a decoy is introduced, it shifts the comparison in favor of the target option. The medium subscription wasn't there to sell. It was there to make the large look like better value. Remove the decoy, and the large suddenly feels expensive again. Add it back, and the large becomes the obvious choice. Companies use this constantly. Streaming services offer a basic plan and a premium plan. Then they add a mid-tier plan that's only slightly cheaper than premium but offers far less. Suddenly, premium looks like the smart choice, even though before the mid-tier appeared it felt overpriced. Cinema popcorn follows the same pattern. Small, medium, large. The medium exists to make the large feel reasonable. Almost no one buys the medium. That's not the point. It's there to reframe how you see the large. The decoy doesn't need to be appealing. It just needs to make the target look better by comparison. You're shopping for laptops. 2 models, both solid. Then you see a third, slightly worse specs, almost the same price as the better one. Now the better one feels like a bargain. You weren't going to buy it before. But the decoy shifted your reference point. The choice that seemed expensive now feels smart. This plays out in relationships too. Someone introduces you to 2 friends. One's charming, one's fine. You're drawn to the charming one, not just because of who they are, but because the comparison made them stand out more. Remove the other person, and the dynamic shifts. The decoy effect doesn't force you to choose. It just rearranges the landscape so one option feels better than it actually is. And because the shift happens unconsciously, you don't realize you've been guided. You think you made the choice. You didn't. The decoy made it for you. Default effect. Organ donation rates in Germany sit around 12%. In Austria, nearly everyone's a donor. Same culture. Same region. Same general population. The only difference. In Germany, you opt in. In Austria, you're automatically enrolled unless you opt out. That single switch, whether donation is the default or not, flips participation rates entirely. Most people never change the default. They just accept whatever's already set. This is the default effect. The overwhelming tendency to stick with pre-selected options, even when changing them costs nothing. It works because making a choice requires effort. Evaluating alternatives, weighing outcomes, deciding if it's worth the switch. But the default requires no effort. It's already done. You didn't have to think about it. So unless the current option is actively painful, most people leave it alone. Not because they analyzed it and decided it's best, because changing it feels harder than letting it ride. You see this everywhere. Software installations. Almost no one adjusts the settings. They click through with everything pre-checked, even options they don't want, because unchecking them means stopping, reading, deciding. Retirement savings plans. Employees automatically contribute whatever percentage the company sets, rarely adjusting it, even when a higher contribution would benefit them. Phone contracts. People stay on outdated plans for years, paying more than they need to, because switching requires research comparison, a phone call. The inertia of the default keeps them locked in. The trap isn't just laziness. It's psychological endorsement. The default feels like a recommendation, like someone already figured out the best option. So why question it? If it's pre-selected, it must be there for a reason. That implicit trust makes people treat defaults as safer, smarter, more legitimate than alternatives, even when the default was chosen arbitrarily or designed to benefit someone else. Businesses exploit this mercilessly. Subscription services auto-renew unless you cancel. You're not actively choosing to continue. You're just not choosing to stop. Email newsletters default to sending daily updates. Unsubscribing takes effort, so most people tolerate the clutter rather than act. Privacy settings default to maximum data sharing. Adjusting them requires navigating menus, reading policies, making decisions. Most users never bother. The default effect doesn't control you by force. It controls you through inertia. It makes doing nothing feel like the easiest, safest choice. And because staying still requires no decision, you never realize how much control you've handed over by simply letting things stay as they are. Status quo bias. You've been using the same bank for 15 years. The fees are higher than competitors. The service is average. Switching would take an hour, maybe less. But you don't. Not this month. Not next month. Maybe someday, but not now. It's not that you've weighed the options and decided staying is best. You just haven't weighed them at all. Because staying requires nothing. And nothing feels easier than something. This is status quo bias. The psychological preference for things to remain as they are, even when change would clearly benefit you. It's not laziness. It's deeper than that. The current state, whatever it is, feels safer, more legitimate. Like the default setting of reality. Changing it means taking responsibility for the outcome. If you switch banks and something goes wrong, it's your fault. But if you stay and things continue as they are, you can blame the system, the bank, anything but your own decision. Inaction feels neutral, but it's not. It's a choice. You're just not acknowledging it as one. The brain is wired to treat the familiar as less risky, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Someone's stuck in a job they've outgrown. The pay's stagnant. The work's unfulfilling. Other opportunities exist. But the current role is known, predictable. Leaving means uncertainty, new colleagues, new expectations, the possibility of failure. So they stay year after year not because it's working, but because imagining the alternative feels harder than tolerating the present. This plays out in relationships. Friendships that stopped adding value years ago. Romantic partnerships that function more like routines than connections. The idea of ending them feels disruptive. Like you'd be the one causing the problem, even though the problem already exists. So you keep going month after month, because maintaining the status quo requires no decision. Changing it does. Companies exploit this relentlessly. Subscriptions that auto-renew. Contracts that require active cancellation. Privacy settings that default to maximum exposure. They know most people won't act. Not because they've chosen to stay, but because they haven't chosen to leave. And in a world where inaction feels like neutrality, that's enough. Status quo bias doesn't keep you safe. It just keeps you still. And while you're standing in place, convinced you're avoiding risk, time's moving, opportunities close, costs accumulate. The gap between where you are and where you could be widens. Not because you made the wrong choice, but because you didn't realize standing still was a choice at all. Paradox of choice. More options should mean more freedom, more control, better outcomes. That's the theory, but in practice, it works the opposite way. The more choices you have, the harder it becomes to choose anything. And when you finally do, you're less satisfied than if you'd had fewer options to begin with. This is the paradox of choice, the counterintuitive reality that abundance doesn't liberate. It paralyzes. It starts with the sheer cognitive load. Every option demands evaluation. Features, trade-offs, opportunity costs. With 3 choices, that's manageable. With 30, it's overwhelming. Your brain wasn't built to process that volume of alternatives efficiently. So instead of feeling empowered, you feel exhausted. The task of choosing becomes harder than the choice itself matters. Then comes the second hit. Regret. When you only had a few options, picking one felt straightforward. You chose, moved on, and didn't look back. But when there are dozens, every choice comes with the nagging awareness of what you didn't pick. Did you miss the better version? Could you have optimized more? The paradox is that having more options doesn't just make deciding harder. It makes being satisfied with your decision nearly impossible. Restaurants with encyclopedic menace. You order something, it's fine. But you can't stop thinking about the other 70 dishes you didn't try. Streaming platforms with endless catalogs. You pick a film. 20 minutes in, you're wondering if something better's waiting 3 scrolls down. The volume of choice doesn't enhance the experience. It contaminates it. And here's where it gets worse. When faced with too many options, people don't just struggle to choose. They start avoiding the decision altogether. They defer. They procrastinate. They pick nothing, hoping clarity will arrive later. It doesn't. The options multiply. The pressure builds. And what started as freedom turns into a trap. The cruel irony is that people assume they want limitless choice. More flavors. More models. More paths. But research shows the opposite. When people are given fewer options, they choose faster, feel better about their choice, and report higher satisfaction afterwards. Constraint doesn't limit freedom. It enables it. The paradox of choice doesn't just slow you down. It rewires how satisfaction works. You stop enjoying what you have because you're haunted by everything you didn't pick. And the more options there are, the more certain you become that the perfect choice exists somewhere just out of reach. Choice paralysis. You're standing in the supermarket aisle. 47 varieties of pasta sauce. Tomato and basil. Roasted garlic. Spicy arrabbiata. Organic. Low sodium. Family size. Single serve. 5 minutes ago, you just needed sauce. Now you're frozen staring at shelves, unable to commit. It's not that the decision matters. It's that the volume of options has shut your brain down entirely. This is choice paralysis. The point where having too many choices stops you from making any choice at all. It's not indecision. It's cognitive overload. When the number of alternatives crosses a threshold, your decision-making system doesn't just slow down. It stalls. The brain can't process that many variables at once, so instead of evaluating options, it locks up. And while you're standing there, stuck, the act of choosing starts to feel impossible. What makes it worse is that every option looks viable. None are clearly superior. If one was obviously best, you'd take it and leave. But when they're all roughly equal, the pressure to pick the right one intensifies. You start second-guessing before you've even decided. What if this one's too sweet? What if that one's overpriced? The fear of making the wrong choice becomes so strong that making no choice feels safer. This doesn't just happen with pasta sauce. Job offers. 3 solid options, similar pay, similar roles, different cities. Instead of choosing and committing, you delay, waiting for certainty that never comes. Investment portfolios. Dozens of funds, all claiming strong returns. Instead of picking one and starting, you research endlessly, paralyzed by the fear of suboptimal allocation. Dating apps. Thousands of profiles. Instead of committing to one connection, you keep swiping, convinced someone better is just ahead. The trap is that paralysis doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like caution, like you're being responsible, thorough, smart. But while you're frozen, opportunity's close. The job offer expires. The investment window shuts. The connection moves on. Paralysis isn't neutral. It's a choice to let circumstance decide for you. And here's the worst part. Even when you finally break through and choose, the paralysis leaves a residue. You're never fully confident. Because with that many options, you can't shake the feeling that you missed something better. Choice paralysis doesn't just stop you from deciding. It poisons the satisfaction of whatever you eventually pick. Framing effect. A doctor tells you about a surgery. 90% survival rate. Sounds reassuring. Another doctor describes the same surgery. 10% mortality rate. Suddenly it feels risky. Same surgery. Same numbers. Same outcome. But the way it's framed, survival versus death, shifts how it lands. And that shift changes decisions. This is the framing effect. How information is presented alters how you perceive it, even when the underlying facts remain identical. The brain doesn't process information objectively. It responds to context, emphasis, and emotional coloring. A product advertised as 95% fat feels healthier than one labeled 5% fat. Same product. Same fat content. But the frame, what you're told to focus on, changes the perception entirely. You're not reacting to the facts. You're reacting to how the facts are packaged. Politicians use this constantly. A policy that cuts spending by 10% can be framed as fiscal responsibility or as abandoning vulnerable communities. Same policy, different frame. And depending on which version you hear first, your position shifts before you've even examined the details. The frame sets the emotional tone. Once that tone is set, it's difficult to override, even when you encounter the same information presented differently later. Marketing thrives on this. Limited time offers create urgency by framing the decision as what you'll lose, not what you'll gain. A discount framed as save £20 feels better than spend £80, even though the final price is identical. The frame directs attention. And wherever attention goes, perception follows. It happens in relationships too. Someone describes a partner as independent. Sounds positive. Someone else calls the same behavior distant. Sounds negative. Same person. Same actions. Different frame. And once the frame is set, it's hard to see past it. The independent partner starts to look emotionally unavailable. The distant partner starts to look self-sufficient. The facts didn't change. The lens did. The framing effect doesn't manipulate you through lies. It manipulates you through emphasis. By controlling what you focus on, it controls how you feel. And how you feel drives what you choose. You think you're responding to information. You're not. You're responding to the way that information was arranged to make you feel a certain way before you'd even finished processing it. Anchoring effect. Someone asks you to guess the population of a city you've never heard of. Before you answer, they mention a number. Any number. Doesn't matter if it's accurate. Once it's in your head, it pulls. If they said 5 million, you'll guess somewhere near that range. If they said 50,000, your estimate drops. The number itself becomes a reference point. And even though you know it's arbitrary, even though it has no real connection to the answer, it shapes your response anyway. This is the anchoring effect. The tendency for an initial piece of information, no matter how irrelevant, to distort all subsequent judgments. It works because your brain needs a starting point. When you don't know the answer, any number feels better than nothing, so you latch onto whatever's provided, then adjust from there. The problem is, you don't adjust enough. The anchor pulls harder than it should. Even when you're aware it's meaningless, even when you're actively trying to ignore it, it still bends your estimate towards itself. Retailers exploit this ruthlessly. A jacket's original price is listed at £300, marked down to £150. The 300 becomes the anchor. You're not evaluating whether £150 is a fair price for the jacket. You're evaluating it against 300. And compared to that anchor, £150 feels like a deal. Whether the jacket was ever worth 300 doesn't matter. The anchor's already done its job. Salary negotiations follow the same pattern. Whoever names a figure first sets the anchor. If you're asked for your salary expectations and you say 50,000, the negotiation revolves around that number. If the employer opens with 60, the anchor shifts higher, and suddenly 60 feels like the baseline. The rest of the conversation adjusts from there, even though both numbers were arbitrary starting points with no inherent logic. It shows up in everyday judgments too. Someone mentions they think a project will take 2 weeks. You had no timeline in mind, but now 2 weeks is lodged in your brain. When you estimate, you'll land somewhere near it. A friend says they think a restaurant bill will be around £80. When it comes to 60, it feels cheap. When it comes to 100, it feels expensive. The anchor, 80, set the frame before you'd even thought about what the meal was worth. The anchoring effect doesn't care if the anchor's logical. It doesn't care if you recognize it as irrelevant. It just needs to be there first. And once it is, every judgment you make afterwards is subtly, invisibly bent in its direction. Scarcity Heuristic. Only 3 left in stock. Limited time offer. Exclusive access. Final chance. The moment you see those words, something shifts. What you were casually considering suddenly feels urgent. Not because the product changed. Not because your need increased. But because the possibility of losing it made it feel more valuable. This is the scarcity heuristic. The psychological principle that scarcity, real or manufactured, drives up perceived value and accelerates decisions. It's hardwired. When something's abundant, your brain treats it as low priority. There's no rush. You can come back later. But when availability drops, urgency spikes. The possibility of missing out triggers a fear response. You stop evaluating whether you actually need the thing. You start focusing on whether you can get it before it's gone. Retailers weaponize this constantly. Flash sales, countdown timers, stock warnings. None of these change the product. They change the context. And the context, scarcity, overrides rational evaluation. You weren't planning to buy those concert tickets. But when you see only 5 seats remaining, logic shuts off. You're not thinking about cost or whether you'll enjoy the show. You're thinking about losing the chance, so you buy. Not because you want it more, because you're afraid of wanting it later and not being able to have it. The cruelty is that most scarcity is artificial. The timer that resets every hour, the limited stock that gets replenished daily, the exclusive access that's offered to everyone in waves. It's theta. But it works, because your brain doesn't have time to verify whether the scarcity is real. It just reacts. This plays out in relationships too. Someone who was lukewarm suddenly becomes interesting the moment they start pulling away. Not because they changed, Because their availability did. The scarcity made them feel more valuable. And once that perception takes hold, you start chasing something you weren't sure you wanted in the first place. The scarcity heuristic doesn't enhance value. It creates the illusion of it. And by the time you realize the urgency was manufactured, you've already committed. Not because the choice was right, because scarcity made waiting feel riskier than deciding. Present bias. A year from now, you'll thank yourself for starting. 6 months from now, you'll see progress. 3 months from now, you'll feel momentum building. But today, the gym membership can wait. The savings plan can start next month. The project can begin after this deadline passes. Future you will handle it. Future you has time, energy, motivation. Present you just wants to get through today. This is present bias. The tendency to prioritize immediate rewards over larger future gains, even when waiting would clearly be better. It's not laziness. It's how the brain weighs time. Rewards that are far away feel abstract, hypothetical, like they belong to a different person. But rewards right now feel real, tangible. Immediate pleasure triggers a stronger emotional response than distant benefit, even when the distant benefit is objectively larger. So you choose the smaller thing now over the bigger thing later, not because you've done the maths wrong, but because your brain discounts future value automatically. This shows up everywhere. You know exercise will pay off in 6 months. Better health. More energy. But right now, the sofa feels better than the treadmill. So you stay. You know saving £100 a month will build into something significant in a year. But spending it today on something you want now feels better than watching a number grow slowly. So you spend. The gap between intention and action isn't about willpower. It's about timing. Future you wants different things than present you. Future you wants the results. Present you wants comfort. And because present you is the one making the decision right now, present you wins. Every time. What makes it worse is that future you keeps getting pushed further out. You'll start tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes next month. The intention stays the same. The timeline just keeps sliding. And while you're waiting for the right moment, the gap between where you are and where you could have been widens. The cruel part is that future you will become present you. And when that happens, you'll look back and wish you'd started earlier. But by then, the moment's gone. Present bias doesn't just delay progress. It ensures that the version of you who wanted change never gets to make the decision. Because the version of you making the decision only cares about now. Delayed discounting. Someone offers you £50 today or 70 in a month. Logically, 70's better. You wait 4 weeks, you gain 20. But most people take the 50. Not because they've calculated that 4 weeks isn't worth £20, but because a month feels like forever. And forever makes £70 feel smaller than it actually is. That's delayed discounting. The longer you have to wait for a reward, the less valuable it feels, even when the objective value stays the same. The brain doesn't process future rewards the same way it processes present ones. A reward available now fires up the system immediately. A reward available later. The brain applies a discount. The further out the reward, the steeper the discount. £20 in a week feels almost as good as £20 today. £20 in a year. Might as well be 5. It's why people struggle with long-term goals. Saving for retirement means delaying gratification for decades. The reward's enormous, a comfortable future, but it's so far away that it barely registers emotionally. Meanwhile, spending that money now on something you can enjoy immediately feels more valuable, even though mathematically it's worth less. This gets worse under stress. When you're struggling financially, the discount rate skyrockets. £100 today can mean food, rent, survival. £100 next month might as well not exist. The future becomes irrelevant because the present is too overwhelming. It's not irrational. It's survival mode. But it locks you into decisions that make the long term worse. Businesses exploit this constantly. Buy now, pay later schemes work because the payment feels distant, discounted. You're not weighing the full cost. You're weighing how good it feels to get the thing now against a vague future obligation that doesn't emotionally register yet. By the time the bill arrives, the discount's worn off, but the commitment's already locked in. And here's the trap. Delay discounting doesn't just make future rewards feel smaller. It makes future consequences feel smaller too. The hangover tomorrow. The credit card bill next month. The health impact in 10 years. All of it gets discounted. So you choose the thing that feels good now, knowing there's a cost later, because later's been emotionally erased. Risk aversion. Would you take a coin flip? Heads, you win £100. Tails, you lose 100. Completely fair odds. Even probability. But you wouldn't do it. Most people wouldn't. Not because the maths doesn't work out. It does. But because the possibility of losing feels heavier than the possibility of winning. And that weight keeps you from taking chances, even when the chances are in your favor. This is risk aversion. The preference for certainty over uncertainty, even when uncertainty offers better expected outcomes. It's why people stay in jobs they've outgrown. The current salary's guaranteed. A new role might pay more, might offer growth, but it also might not work out. That uncertainty, the risk of it going wrong, feels worse than the certainty of staying stuck. So they stay. Not because staying's better. Because it's known. You see it in investments. Someone has money sitting in a savings account earning almost nothing. They know stocks historically outperform savings. They know the long-term odds favor investing. But stocks go up and down. Savings just sit there, stable, predictable. The fear of watching the value drop, even temporarily, keeps them from taking the better long-term bet. The brain treats potential loss as more painful than equivalent gain feels good. Losing £100 hurts more than winning 100 feels satisfying. That asymmetry makes any choice involving risk feel dangerous, even when the risk is small and the reward is large. What's strange is that risk aversion isn't consistent. It depends on framing. Someone will refuse a fair bet when things are going well, but when they're already losing, suddenly they'll take bigger risks to try and recover. The same person who won't gamble £50 when they're comfortable will gamble 200 when they're desperate. Risk aversion protects you when you're ahead, but it flips when you're behind. And here's the cost. Playing it safe feels like protection. But certainty comes with a price. You avoid risk, you avoid loss. But you also avoid growth, the opportunities you don't take, the bets you don't make. Risk aversion doesn't keep you safe. It keeps you still. And while you're standing still, convinced you're protecting what you have, the gap between where you are and where you could be keeps widening. Risk-seeking in losses. You're down £200 at the casino. You could walk away, accept the loss, go home. But you don't. You double your bet. Not because the odds improved. They didn't. But because accepting the loss feels unbearable. So you chase it. You take bigger risks not to win, but to avoid admitting you've already lost. This is risk-seeking in losses. The tendency to take greater risks when you're already behind, desperately trying to recover what's gone. It's the mirror image of risk aversion. When things are going well, you play it safe. You protect what you have. But when you're losing, the rules flip. Suddenly, risky bets that you'd never take when you were ahead feel justified. Because the alternative, locking in the loss, feels worse than gambling for recovery. Investors do this constantly. A stock drops. Instead of selling and moving on, they hold, hoping it'll bounce back. It keeps dropping. Now they're down even more. But selling now would mean accepting a bigger loss than before, so they hold longer. Or worse, they buy more, averaging down, convincing themselves the recovery's coming. The loss keeps growing, but admitting it feels impossible. It happens in relationships too. You've invested years into something that isn't working. Walking away means accepting that those years didn't lead where you hoped. So instead of leaving, you double down. More effort. More compromise. More time. Not because you believe it'll improve, but because quitting feels like confirming the loss. And confirming the loss is harder than continuing to lose. The psychology is brutal. When you're losing, your risk tolerance doesn't decrease. It explodes. You'll take bets you'd never consider otherwise, chasing the idea that one big win will erase everything. But it doesn't work that way. The bigger risks just create bigger losses. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to stop. What makes it worse is that risk-seeking in losses doesn't feel reckless. It feels necessary. Like you're being strategic, fighting back, refusing to give up. But you're not fighting the loss. You're running from it. And the further you run, the more you lose. Prospect theory. Here's the asymmetry. Losing £10 hurts more than gaining £10 feels good. Winning 100 feels great, but losing 100 feels devastating. The pain of loss outweighs the pleasure of gain, consistently, predictably. And that imbalance shapes every decision you make, even when you don't realize it. This is prospect theory, the framework that explains how people actually make decisions under risk, not how they should, but how they do. Traditional economics assumes people weigh outcomes objectively. Gain 100, lose 100, equal impact. But that's not how it works. The brain doesn't treat gains and losses symmetrically. It overweights losses. Psychologically, a loss is roughly twice as painful as an equivalent gain is pleasurable. That skew drives behavior in ways logic can't explain. It's why people hold losing investments too long. Selling locks in the loss. And locking in a loss feels worse than holding and hoping, even when holding makes the loss worse. The pain of realizing the loss is so intense that people will take irrational risks to avoid it. It's also why people sell winning investments too early. Once you're ahead, the fear of losing those gains kicks in. You lock in the profit, not because it's the optimal move, but because the possibility of watching it disappear feels unbearable. Prospect theory doesn't make you maximize value. It makes you minimize regret. Framing shifts everything. A surgery with a 90% survival rate feels safer than one with a 10% mortality rate. Same surgery, same odds. But survival feels like a gain. Mortality feels like a loss. And because losses loom larger, the mortality frame triggers more fear, even though the information's identical. This plays out in everyday choices. You'll drive across town to save £10 on a £50 purchase. But you won't drive across town to save £10 on a £500 purchase. Rationally, £10 is £10. But relative to the total, the £50 purchase feels like a bigger gain. Prospect theory doesn't care about absolute value. It cares about how the value's framed relative to a reference point. And that's the trap. You're not making decisions based on outcomes. You're making them based on how outcomes feel relative to where you started. And because feelings are shaped by framing, two identical choices can produce completely different decisions, depending on whether they're presented as gains or losses. Regret aversion. You're standing at a crossroads. Two options. One safe, familiar, probably fine. The other's uncertain, riskier, but could be better. You choose the safe one. Later you find out the risky option would have worked. And now, instead of feeling relieved you avoided risk, you feel regret. Not because the safe choice failed. It didn't. But because you'll never know what the other path held. And not knowing feels worse than the security you chose. This is regret aversion, the fear of future regret influencing decisions more than the actual outcomes of those decisions. It works in two directions: action regret and inaction regret. Action regret is what you feel when you do something and it goes wrong. You took the job, it didn't work out, you regret the move. Inaction regret is what you feel when you don't do something and miss out. You didn't take the job, it would have been great, you regret not trying. Here's the strange part. Inaction regret tends to hurt more. People feel worse about chances they didn't take, the mistakes they made, the relationship you didn't pursue, the investment you didn't make, the trip you didn't book. These haunt longer than the things you tried and failed at. Because with action, at least you know. With inaction, you're left imagining what could have been. And imagination makes it feel bigger than it probably was. So regret aversion pushes you towards inaction. If you don't choose, you can't regret the choice. If you don't try, you can't fail. But inaction isn't neutral. It's a choice. And later, it'll hurt worse than most of the active mistakes you could have made. This shows up everywhere. Someone doesn't ask for a raise because they're afraid of rejection. But later, they regret not trying more than they would have regretted hearing no. Someone doesn't end a relationship that's clearly over because they're afraid they'll regret it. But staying creates a different kind of regret, the kind that builds slowly, the kind that says you knew and you stayed anyway. What makes regret aversion cruel is that it doesn't protect you from regret. It just shifts which regrets you'll carry. And the regrets that come from not trying, from staying safe, from avoiding the decision, those are the ones that linger. Because action regret comes with closure. You tried. It didn't work. You move on. Inaction regret never closes. It just asks the same question forever. Maximising. The best restaurant in the city. The perfect flat. The ideal partner. Not just good, the best. You scroll through reviews, compare ratings, cross-reference recommendations. Hours pass. You're not deciding. You're hunting for certainty that the absolute optimal choice exists, and you'll find it if you just keep looking. Maximisers don't settle. They optimize. Every decision is a search for the peak option. Not good enough. Not even great. Perfect. And that search never ends, because perfect is always one more comparison away. It sounds rational. Why settle for adequate when excellent might exist? But maximising doesn't lead to better outcomes. It leads to exhaustion, because the search for perfect requires evaluating everything. Every restaurant, every flat, every option. And the more you evaluate, the harder it becomes to commit, because there's always the possibility that something better is still out there, just beyond the next review, the next listing, the next swipe. What makes it worse is that even when maximisers choose, they're rarely satisfied. They picked the best option available. But was it truly the best? Could they have searched longer? Found something they missed? The decision's made, but the doubt lingers. And that doubt poisons the satisfaction of whatever they chose. You see it everywhere. Job hunting. Someone has 3 solid offers. Instead of picking one and moving forwards, they keep interviewing, convinced a better role exists. By the time they decide, one offer's expired, another's been filled, and they're left with the third, wondering if they missed the perfect one. Dating. Every profile might be the one, so no one's ever quite good enough. The search continues endlessly, because committing to someone means closing off the possibility of finding someone better. The trap is that maximising feels like diligence, like you're being smart, thorough, responsible. But you're not optimizing outcomes. You're optimizing anxiety. The more options you consider, the more certain you become that you didn't consider enough. And while you're searching for perfect, good enough opportunities close, time passes, and the gap between where you are and where you could have been grows. Maximisers don't find the best. They just ensure they'll never feel like they did. Satisficing, good enough, not perfect, not optimal. just sufficient. The flat's fine, the job works, the choice fits. You could keep looking, sure, maybe something better exists. But this meets your needs, so you take it and move on. This is satisficing. The strategy of setting a threshold for acceptable and stopping once you hit it, rather than searching endlessly for the absolute best. It's not laziness, it's efficiency. Satisficers recognize that searching has a cost. Time, energy, mental load, and past a certain point, the cost of continuing to search outweighs the benefit of finding something marginally better. So they set a standard, usually based on what actually matters, and when an option meets that standard, they choose it. The difference between satisficing and maximising isn't about standards. It's about stopping points. A maximizer needs the best. A satisficer needs good enough. And good enough, defined clearly, gets you to the same place with far less effort. What's surprising is that satisficers report higher satisfaction. Not because they make better choices. They don't, but because they're not haunted by what they didn't pick. They chose something that worked. It's working. That's sufficient. No regret about the paths not taken. No lingering doubt about whether a better option existed 3 listings down. You see this in action constantly. Someone's buying headphones. A maximizer reads every review, compares every spec, builds spreadsheets. 3 weeks later, they buy something, but they're not sure it's the best. A satisficer decides what matters: sound quality, comfort, price, finds the first option that ticks those boxes, and buys it. Same outcome. But the satisficer spent 3 hours where the maximizer spent 3 weeks. And the satisficer's happier with the choice, because they weren't comparing it to an imagined ideal. Relationships, jobs, cities, meals. The pattern holds. Satisficers move faster, stress less, and feel better about their decisions afterwards. Not because they aim lower, but because they know when to stop looking. The cruel irony is that maximizers, in their hunt for the best, often end up worse off. Not because they made bad choices, but because the process of choosing became so exhausting, so doubt-filled, that even the right choice feels wrong. Satisficing doesn't lower your standards. It protects you from the paralysis of perfection. Escalation of commitment. 6 months into a project that's clearly failing. The budget's blown. The timeline's missed. The results aren't there. Everyone can see it's not working, but instead of cutting losses and moving on, the team doubles down. More money. More time. More effort. Not because the project suddenly makes sense, but because walking away now would mean admitting the last 6 months were wasted. This is escalation of commitment. The tendency to invest more resources into a failing course of action simply because you've already invested so much. It's the sunk cost fallacy taken further. You're not just holding on to what you've lost. You're actively adding to the loss, convinced that one more push, one more injection of time or money or effort will turn it around. But it won't. The project's fundamentals haven't changed. Only your investment has. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to stop. What drives it is pride and denial. Stopping means admitting you were wrong. That the initial decision was a mistake. That all the time and money and energy you've already spent achieved nothing. And that admission feels unbearable. So instead of facing it, you keep going, telling yourself the next phase will vindicate everything that came before. You see this in business constantly. A product launch isn't working. Sales are weak. Feedback's negative. The rational move is to pivot or shut it down. But the company's already spent millions on development, marketing, infrastructure. Stopping feels like failure. So they keep funding it, hoping the market will shift, that the next campaign will break through. Years later, the product's still hemorrhaging money, but by then so much has been invested that killing it feels impossible. It happens in personal decisions too. You've been in a degree program for 2 years. You hate it. It's not leading where you thought. But quitting means those 2 years were for nothing. So you finish, not because the degree has value, but because abandoning it now would confirm the waste. 5 years later, you're working in a completely different field, and the degree sits unused. The 2 years were already lost. Finishing just added 3 more. The trap is that escalation of commitment disguises itself as perseverance, as resilience, as refusing to give up. But there's a difference between persistence in the face of obstacles and denial in the face of failure. Persistence adjusts tactics. Escalation just keeps pouring resources into a hole. And the deeper the hole, the harder it becomes to see that you're digging. Ambiguity aversion. 2 bets. First one, you know the odds. Flip a coin, 50-50, heads you win, tails you lose. Second one, the odds are unclear. Could be 60-40 in your favor. Could be 40-60 against. Could be 50-50. You don't know. But the potential payout's the same. Most people take the first bet, not because it's better, but because it's known. This is ambiguity aversion. The preference for known risks over unknown ones, even when the unknown risks might actually be better. It's not about avoiding risk. It's about avoiding uncertainty. When you know the odds, you can prepare. You can weigh the decision. When the odds are murky, you're flying blind. And flying blind feels dangerous, even when the landing might be softer. The brain wants predictability. Known risks feel manageable. Unknown risks feel chaotic. So even when the ambiguous option offers better expected value, people shy away. They'd rather face a clear danger than an unclear opportunity. This shows up everywhere. Investing. Someone has the choice between a fund with clear historical returns and a fund in an emerging market with less data. The emerging market might outperform, but the lack of information makes it feel riskier, so they stick with the known option, even though the known option's returns are mediocre. Career moves. A promotion in your current company versus a role at a startup. The promotion's predictable, clear salary, known culture. The startup's uncertain. Could be massive growth. Could collapse. Most people take the promotion not because it's objectively better, but because the ambiguity of the startup makes it feel more dangerous than it might actually be. What's strange is that ambiguity aversion can push you towards worse outcomes. You avoid the ambiguous bet because you don't know the odds. But avoiding it means missing chances where the ambiguity was hiding better odds than the clear alternative. You play it safe. But safe isn't always best. Sometimes it's just familiar. The real cost isn't the specific choice. It's the pattern. Every time you choose certainty over ambiguity, you're narrowing your range. You're limiting yourself to the world you already know. And the world you already know is, by definition, the one with the least growth potential. Probability neglect. A 1 in a million chance of a plane crash. Statistically irrelevant. You're more likely to die driving to the airport. But the moment you're on the plane, turbulence hits, and logic evaporates. The odds haven't changed. 1 in a million is still 1 in a million. But your brain isn't processing probability. It's processing fear. And fear makes 1 in a million feel like 50-50. This is probability neglect. The tendency to ignore actual statistical likelihood when emotions are involved, especially fear. It's why people buy lottery tickets. The odds of winning are absurdly low, millions to 1. But the possibility, however remote, feels real. The brain doesn't weigh the probability. It imagines the outcome. And once you're imagining the outcome, the odds stop mattering. You're not thinking, this probably won't happen. You're thinking, but what if it does? The same mechanism works in reverse with fear. Terrorist attacks, shark attacks, plane crashes, statistically rare, but emotionally vivid. And because they're vivid, they feel more likely than they are. You avoid flying even though driving's far more dangerous. You fear the attack even though it's statistically improbable. The probabilities are relevant. The emotions doing the deciding. This creates completely irrational behavior. Someone refuses to fly but drives everywhere. They're increasing their risk while thinking they're reducing it. Someone buys insurance for events so unlikely they'll almost certainly never happen, but they don't save for retirement, which is almost certain. The probable gets ignored. The emotionally charged, however improbable, dominates. What makes it worse is that marketers and media exploit this relentlessly. Rare but terrifying events get constant coverage, making them feel common. You see the same plane crash story for a week, and suddenly flying feels dangerous, even though statistically nothing's changed. The availability of the information, how often you see it, distorts your perception of the probability. Politicians do this too. Rare threats get amplified. The odds are tiny, but the fear's enormous, so policies get built around protecting against statistically insignificant dangers while ignoring actual, common risks that lack the emotional punch. Probability neglect doesn't make you cautious. It makes you miscalibrated. You overact to the unlikely and underact to the probable. And the gap between where you think the risks are and where they actually are grows every time emotion overrides the numbers. Pseudo-Certainty Effect. 2 scenarios. First, you're guaranteed to save 200 lives. Second, there's a 1/3 chance you save 600 lives, and a 2/3 chance you save no one. Same expected value. 200 lives either way, but most people choose the first. The guarantee feels safer, more certain, even though mathematically they're identical. Now flip it. First option, 200 people will definitely die. Second, 1/3 chance no one dies, 2/3 chance 600 die. Same maths, same expected value. But now, most people pick the second option. The gamble. Because when it's framed as loss, certainty feels unbearable. This is the pseudo-certainty effect. The illusion that certain outcomes are more valuable than uncertain ones, even when the probabilities make them equivalent. It's driven by framing. When options are presented as gains, people want certainty. Lock in the win. Avoid the risk. But when options are framed as losses, people suddenly become risk-seeking. They'll gamble to avoid the certain loss, even though the gamble's expected outcome is identical. The maths doesn't change. The probabilities don't shift. But how it's described, saving versus losing, alters the decision completely. Your brain treats guaranteed gain as more valuable than probable gain of the same size. And it treats probable loss as more tolerable than guaranteed loss, again of the same size. You see this everywhere. Insurance. People overpay for certainty. They'll spend more to eliminate a small risk entirely than they'd spend to reduce a large risk significantly, because eliminating the risk creates the feeling of certainty. Even though reducing the larger risk saves more expected loss, it doesn't feel as safe. Investments. Guaranteed returns, however small, feel better than probable returns, however large. People park money in savings accounts earning almost nothing because the return's certain. Meanwhile, they avoid investments with higher expected returns because the returns fluctuate. The certainty's fake. Inflation erodes the savings. But it feels certain, and that feeling overrides the maths. The pseudo-certainty effect doesn't make you safer. It makes you pay for the feeling of safety, and that feeling costs more than the actual risk you're avoiding. You're not buying protection. You're buying comfort. And comfort, especially false comfort, is expensive. Endowment Effect. You're selling a mug. Someone offers you £3, refuse. That's too low. The mug's worth at least 5, maybe 6. But here's the thing. 5 minutes ago, before you owned it, you wouldn't have paid more than £3 for that exact same mug. Nothing about the mug changed. Only your relationship to it did. And that shift, from not having it to having it, made it feel more valuable than it actually is. This is the endowment effect. The tendency to overvalue things simply because you own them. It's not rational. The mug's the same mug, same function, same condition, but the moment it became yours, your brain applied a premium. Ownership creates attachment, and attachment inflates perceived value. You'd never pay £6 to acquire it. But now that you have it, £6 feels like a fair price to give it up. The asymmetry is brutal. What you'd pay to gain something is consistently lower than what you'd demand to lose it. And that gap between buying price and selling price exists purely in your head. The market hasn't changed. The object hasn't changed. Your sense of loss has. This shows up everywhere. Someone inherits furniture. It's outdated. They don't particularly like it, but selling it feels wrong because it's theirs now. The emotional weight of ownership makes letting go feel like loss, even when keeping it serves no purpose. Houses, cars, clothes you never wear. Once you own them, they feel more valuable than they'd feel if you were considering buying them new. What makes it worse is that the endowment effect doesn't just inflate value. It creates inertia. You hold on to things longer than you should. Not because they're useful, because parting with them triggers the pain of loss. And the longer you hold them, the more attacked you become, and the harder it gets to let go. The trap isn't ownership itself. It's the illusion that owning something changes what it's worth. It doesn't. It just changes how losing it would feel. And that feeling keeps you locked into things that stopped adding value long ago. Opportunity cost neglect. You spend £50 on concert tickets. The night of the show, you're exhausted. You don't want to go, but you already paid. So you drag yourself there, sit through 2 hours you're not enjoying, and come home drained. You tell yourself it wasn't wasted because you used the tickets. But it was. Because the real cost wasn't the £50. It was the evening. And that evening could have been spent resting, recovering, doing something you actually wanted. You ignored the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is what you give up when you make a choice. Not just the money. The time. The energy. The alternative. Every decision closes doors. And most of the time, you're not even looking at what you're closing. People fixate on the obvious cost. The price. The immediate expense. But they miss the hidden cost, what else that money or time or effort could have done. You buy a car. The cost isn't just the purchase price. It's the insurance, the maintenance, the hours spent in traffic, the alternative uses for that money. But those don't register. The price tag does. So you make the decision based on incomplete information. This plays out constantly. Someone takes a job because the salary's higher. They don't factor in the commute, the stress, the hours. A year later, they're miserable. The salary was higher, but the opportunity cost, the time with family, the mental health, the flexibility they gave up, was far greater than the salary gain. Relationships. You stay because of what you've invested. But you're not weighing what staying costs you. The growth you're not experiencing. The connections you're not making. The version of yourself you're not becoming. Opportunity cost doesn't scream. It just quietly accumulates in the background while you focus on the choice in front of you. The cruelest part is that opportunity costs are invisible until it's too late. You don't see what you gave up because you're busy dealing with what you chose. And by the time you realize the alternative would have been better, the opportunity's gone. Opportunity cost neglect doesn't just make you choose poorly. It makes you believe you chose well, right up until the moment you can't ignore what you lost anymore. Mental accounting. You find £20 on the street. Bonus. You spend it on drinks that night without thinking twice. But that same £20 from your salary. You'd never spend it that casually. You'd budget it. Save it. Treat it like it matters. Same money. Same value. But because it came from different sources, your brain filed it in different mental accounts. And those accounts have different rules. This is mental accounting. The tendency to treat money differently depending on where it came from, where it's going, or how it's labeled, even though money is fungible and a pound is a pound. It's completely irrational. £20 is £20. Doesn't matter if you earned it, found it, or won it. But your brain doesn't process it that way. Found money feels like free money, so you spend it freely. Earned money feels like hard-won money, so you guard it. The value's identical. The psychology isn't. You see this everywhere. Someone gets a tax refund. Instead of treating it like part of their annual income, which it is, they treat it like a windfall. So they spend it on something they'd never buy with regular salary. A holiday. A gadget, something indulgent. If that same money had come in their monthly paycheck, they'd have saved it or used it for bills. But because it arrived as a lump sum labeled refund, it went into a different mental account. And that account had looser rules. Budgeting amplifies this. You set aside money for groceries, entertainment, savings. Separate buckets. And once money's in a bucket, it's locked there, even when flexibility would make more sense. You're short on grocery money but have extra in the entertainment fund. Logically, you'd relocate. But mental accounting makes that feel wrong. The entertainment money isn't grocery money, even though it's all just money. Credit cards exploit this mercilessly. Spending with a card doesn't feel like spending cash. It goes into a different mental account. The pain of payment is delayed, abstracted. So you spend more with a card than you would with cash, even though the cost to your finances is identical. Mental accounting doesn't help you manage money. It helps you lie to yourself about how you're managing money. And those lies accumulate until the mental accounts and the actual account no longer match. Partition dependence. You're given a plate with 3 sections. Salad, main, dessert. You fill each section. End of the meal, your plate's empty, but you're stuffed. The next night, same meal, no dividers. You take less. Not because you're less hungry. Because the partitions told you how much to take. And you followed them, even though the portions were arbitrary. This is partition dependence. The tendency to let how options are divided shape how much you consume or choose, even when the divisions are meaningless. It's everywhere. Investment portfolios. You're told to split your savings across 5 categories. Stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities, cash. Equal portions. You follow the structure not because it fits your goals, but because the structure exists. Remove the categories and you'd allocate differently. The partitions shape the choice. To-do lists. You break a project into 10 tasks. You treat each one as equal weight, even though 3 of them are critical and 7 are minor. But because they're listed separately, you give them similar attention. The partition, the separation into distinct tasks, made them feel equivalent when they weren't. It's why people overspend when payment plans break a cost into smaller chunks. £1,000 purchase feels expensive. But £50 a month for 20 months, that feels manageable. The total's the same. But the partition, splitting it into installments, changed how the cost registered. The structure dictated the perception. Companies use this relentlessly. Streaming services. £5 a month doesn't feel like £60 a year. The monthly partition makes the cost feel smaller, even though you're paying the same total. Gym memberships. Weekly payments. Phone contracts. Same tactic. Partition the cost, and the pain of payment shrinks, even though the financial impact doesn't. What makes partition dependence dangerous is that it operates invisibly. You think you're choosing based on the options themselves. You're not. You're choosing based on how the options were packaged. And whoever controls the packaging controls your decision. Omission bias. A child's sick. There's a vaccine. Small risk of side effects. Tiny but real. You don't vaccinate. The child catches the illness and suffers. You feel terrible, but not as terrible as you'd feel if you'd given the vaccine and the side effects occurred. Same outcome, a sick child. But one came from action, giving the vaccine. The other came from inaction, not giving it. And inaction feels less blameworthy, even when the harm's identical. This is omission bias. The tendency to judge harmful inactions as less wrong than harmful actions, even when the consequences are the same. It's not logical. Harm is harm. Doesn't matter if it came from doing something or not doing something. But psychologically, doing feels more responsible. If you act and something goes wrong, it's your fault. If you don't act and something goes wrong, it feels like circumstance. Like bad luck. Not your doing. This plays out constantly. Someone's in a failing relationship. They don't end it. The relationship deteriorates. Both people suffer. But staying, doing nothing, feels less cruel than leaving, even though staying caused the same pain. The harm from inaction gets mentally excused in a way the harm from action wouldn't. Investing. You hold a stock that's clearly dropping. You don't sell. It crashes. You lose money. But you feel less regret than if you'd sold, bought something else, and that something else crashed. Same loss. But the first loss came from doing nothing. The second would have come from doing something. And doing something makes you feel more accountable. Career decisions. You stay in a role that's not working. Years pass. Opportunities close. Growth stalls. But staying felt safer than leaving because staying was an action. Leaving would have been action. And action carries the weight of responsibility. So you stay, and the cost accumulates, but it never feels like your fault the way a bad decision from action would. Omission bias doesn't protect you from harm. It just lets you pretend the harm wasn't your choice. And that pretense keeps you locked in patterns of inaction, even when action's the only way forwards. Action bias. Something's going wrong. You don't know what. You don't know why. But you can't just sit there. You have to do something. Anything. So you act. You make a change. Adjust the plan. Shift the strategy. Not because you've diagnosed the problem. Because doing nothing feels unbearable. This is action bias. The compulsion to act, even when inaction would produce better results, simply because doing something feels more responsible than doing nothing. It's the opposite of omission bias. Where omission bias makes you freeze, action bias makes you flail. Neither is rational, but action bias feels productive. You're taking control, making moves. Refusing to be passive. Except half the time, you're not solving the problem. You're just creating new ones. Football managers demonstrate this perfectly. Their team's losing. They make a substitution, not because they've identified a tactical fix. Because fans expect action. Sitting still looks like giving up. So they substitute, even when the substitution makes things worse. Action feels like leadership. But sometimes leadership is knowing when to leave things alone. Investing. The market dips. Panic sets in. You sell, buy, rebalance. Anything to feel like you're managing the situation. But research shows that people who do nothing during market volatility often outperform people who trade actively. The action didn't help. It just made you feel like you were helping. Relationships. Something feels off. Instead of waiting, observing, understanding what's actually wrong, you push for a conversation. Demand answers. Force a resolution. The action makes things worse, but doing nothing felt impossible. So you acted, and the problem you were trying to solve became the problem you created. The trap is that action bias doesn't feel like bias. It feels like diligence. Like refusing to be passive. But action without diagnosis isn't diligence. It's reaction. And reaction, however well-intentioned, often does more harm than the patience to wait for clarity would have. Action bias doesn't solve problems. It just makes you feel better about having them. Confirmation bias in choice. You bought the car. Expensive. stretched your budget. But it's yours now. And suddenly, every review praising that model jumps out at you. Every article about reliability. Every forum post from satisfied owners. Meanwhile, the complaints, the recalls, the negative experiences, those slide past. You're not actively ignoring them. They just don't register the same way. Because you've already decided. And now your brain's looking for proof you decided correctly. Once you choose, your relationship with information changes. You stop seeking truth. You start seeking validation. Confirmation bias doesn't begin at the choice. It intensifies after it. Before you bought the car, you might have weighed pros and cons evenly. After, the pros get amplified. The cons get dismissed. Your brain's protecting the decision by filtering reality to match it. It's not dishonesty. It's self-preservation. Admitting you made a poor choice feels worse than believing you made a good one. So your brain does the work for you. It surfaces information that supports the choice and buries information that challenges it. You're not lying to yourself. You're just more receptive to certain truths than others. This shows up everywhere. You pick a university. Suddenly, every story about successful alumni from that university feels relevant. Every ranking that rates it highly gets remembered. Stories about graduates who struggled. About programs that disappointed. Those get filed away as exceptions. Not because you're actively ignoring them. Because your brain's building a narrative where your choice was right. Relationships. You commit to someone. Now, every moment of compatibility feels significant. Every shared interest, every easy conversation, proof you made the right call. The incompatibilities. The warning signs you noticed before committing. They're still there. But they don't feel as important anymore. Confirmation bias doesn't erase them. It just adjusts their weight. The danger isn't the bias itself. It's that it makes course correction harder. When you're constantly feeding yourself evidence that you're right, recognizing when you're wrong becomes nearly impossible. You're not evaluating the choice anymore. You're defending it. And the longer you defend it, the more entrenched you become, even when the evidence against it keeps mounting. Post-decision rationalization. The choice is made. It wasn't easy. You wavered. You doubted. You almost went the other way. But now it's done. And strangely, you feel certain. Not because new information arrived, but because deciding removed the uncertainty. And your brain, needing to believe the decision was right, builds a story to justify it. This is post-decision rationalization. The process of creating reasons after the fact to support a choice you've already made, convincing yourself that the decision was more logical than it actually was. Before the choice, the options felt evenly matched, genuinely difficult to separate. But the moment you choose, that balance disappears. The option you picked suddenly seems obviously better. The option you rejected suddenly seems obviously worse. Your brain didn't discover new information. It reframed the old information to align with the decision. It works like this. You chose the job with the longer commute but better pay. Before deciding, the commute felt like a real drawback. After deciding, you tell yourself the commute's not that bad. You'll use the time to listen to podcasts. The pay's what really matters. And besides, the other job probably had hidden issues you didn't notice. You're not making this up consciously. Your brain's rewriting the calculus to make the chosen option feel inevitable. Purchases. You bought the more expensive phone. Before, you weren't sure it was worth the extra cost. After, you convince yourself the features justify it. The camera's better. The battery lasts longer. You'll keep it for years, so the cost averages out. The cheaper phone probably would have broken sooner. You're building a case retroactively for a decision that was already made. What makes this dangerous is that it creates false confidence. You start believing the choice was easier than it was, that the reasons were clearer, that you were more certain. And that false confidence makes you trust your decision-making process more than you should. You didn't make a good decision. You made a decision, then convinced yourself it was good. Post-decision rationalization doesn't improve your choices. It just makes you feel better about them. And feeling better about a bad choice doesn't make it less bad. It just makes you slower to realize you need to change course. Choice supportive bias. Ask someone about a decision they made years ago. They'll tell you it was the right call, even if it wasn't. Even if the outcome was objectively poor. Because once time passes, memory doesn't preserve the choice accurately. It preserves it favorably. The positives get remembered. The negatives fade. And what you're left with is a version of the past where you made better decisions than you actually did. Choice supportive bias is the tendency to remember your chosen options as better than they were, and your rejected options as worse, simply because you chose one and not the other. It rewrites history quietly. You picked a flat. At the time, it had issues. Noise. Poor lighting. Awkward layout. But a few years later, when you think back, those problems shrink. You remember the good parts, the location, the price, the moments you enjoyed. Meanwhile, the flat you didn't choose, the one that was genuinely competitive. Memory exaggerates its flaws. The space was too small. The neighborhood wasn't great, even though at the time it was a tough call. The brain's doing damage control. If you remember the unchosen option as roughly equal or better, you'd regret the choice. Regret's painful, so memory adjusts. The chosen option gets a boost. The unchosen option gets a penalty. And over time, what felt like a coin flip starts feeling like an obvious decision. This plays out in relationships. Someone asks if you regret not dating a person you turned down years ago. You say no. You remember why it wouldn't have worked. But the truth is, at the time, it might have. Memory's not preserving accuracy. It's preserving your sense that you made the right call. Career decisions. You took one job over another. Years later, you're certain it was the better choice. But was it? Or have you inflated the benefits of the path you took and minimized the benefits of the path you didn't? You'll never know, because choice supportive bias has rewritten the comparison. The problem isn't that you feel good about your past choices. It's that feeling good about them makes you overconfident in your decision-making. You look back and see a pattern of good calls. But what you're seeing isn't accuracy. It's memory protecting your ego. And if you trust that distorted record, you'll keep making the same kinds of choices, assuming they've always worked out when they haven't. Preference reversal. Here is the setup. 2 options. Option A, a safe bet. Small reward, high probability. Option B, a risky bet. Large reward, low probability. You're asked which you prefer. You pick A. Makes sense. You're risk averse. Then you're asked to price both options. How much would you pay for A? How much for B? And suddenly, you price B higher. Not by a little. Significantly higher, even though you just said you preferred A. This is preference reversal. Your stated preference, which option you'd choose, contradicts your revealed preference, how much you'd pay. Same options, same person. Different answers depending on how the question's framed. It's irrational. If you prefer A, you should value it more. But that's not how the brain works. When you're choosing, you focus on probability. Safe feels better. When you're pricing, you focus on magnitude. Big reward feels more valuable. The shift in focus changes the evaluation, even though the options haven't changed. This happens constantly. Someone's offered 2 jobs. One stable, decent pay, low risk. One volatile, higher potential pay, uncertain. They choose the stable one. But if you asked them to assign a financial value to each opportunity, they'd value the risky one higher. Their choice says they want safety. Their pricing says they value upside. The preferences don't align. Investing. You'd rather own a stable stock than a volatile one. But if forced to sell, you'd demand more for the volatile stock. Your preference, stable, conflicts with your valuation, volatile, worth more. The reversal exposes that you're not evaluating options consistently. You're evaluating them based on context. And context shouldn't change what something's worth to you, but it does. What makes preference reversal troubling is that it reveals decision-making isn't coherent. You don't have fixed values for things. You have context-dependent values. And depending on how a choice is framed, choosing versus pricing, comparing versus evaluating alone, your answer changes. You think you know what you want. But what you want shifts based on how you're asked. Preference reversal doesn't mean you're confused. It means your preferences aren't as stable as you think. And if they're not stable, trusting them becomes a lot harder. Hot-cold empathy gap. You're calm, well-rested, thinking clearly. Someone asks if you'd stay disciplined during a stressful week. Of course, your meal prep. Exercise. Stick to the plan. You're confident. Then the stressful week arrives. You're exhausted. Overwhelmed. Suddenly, discipline feels impossible. The plan you committed to when you were calm doesn't fit the reality of how you feel now. And you can't understand why you ever thought it would. This is the hot-cold empathy gap, the inability to accurately predict how you'll behave in a different emotional state. When you're cold, calm, and rational, you can't imagine how hot states, stress, hunger, anger, desire, will override your intentions. And when you're hot, those calm predictions feel irrelevant. It's not weakness. It's a failure of imagination. Your brain, when calm, believes willpower is infinite. That logic will prevail. That future you will make the same choices present you would make. But future you isn't operating under the same conditions. And the gap between how you think you'll act and how you actually act when emotions hit is enormous. You see this everywhere. Someone's grocery shopping on a full stomach. They plan a healthy week. Vegetables, lean protein, balanced meals. Then they get home after a long day hungry and tired, and nothing they bought appeals. They order takeaway. The plan made sense when they weren't hungry. But hunger's a hot state. And in that state, the cold logic of healthy eating loses. Relationships. You're calm. You promise you won't get defensive during the next argument. You'll listen. Stay rational. But the argument starts, emotions rise, and defensiveness kicks in instantly. The version of you that made the promise isn't the version of you in the argument. Hot you doesn't have access to cold you's clarity. The gap works both ways. When you're stressed, you think you'll always feel this way. You can't imagine the relief of calm. When you're calm, you think stress won't affect you. You can't imagine the chaos of overwhelm. Both are wrong. But you act on those wrong predictions, and the results don't match expectations. The hot-cold empathy gap doesn't mean you lack discipline. It means you're planning for a version of yourself that doesn't exist in the moment you need the plan to work. And until you account for the gap, your predictions about your own behavior will keep failing. Temporal discounting. Imagine someone offered you a choice. £10 now or £15 in a week. Rationally, 15's better. It's more money. The wait's short. But most people take the 10. Not because they need it immediately. Because waiting makes the 15 feel less valuable. A week's delay shrinks the reward. And the further out the reward, the smaller it feels, even though objectively it's larger. Temporal discounting. The principle that future rewards lose value the further away they are, even when the actual reward stays the same. It's why savings fail. Putting away money now means less consumption today. The future benefit, financial security, feels distant. Abstract. The present cost, less spending, feels immediate. So you skip the savings. Not because you don't value security, Because security's too far away to feel as real as what you're giving up now. The brain doesn't process time neutrally. It applies a discount rate. The longer you wait, the steeper the discount. £100 in a year feels worth less than £80 today, even though 100's objectively more. The delay deflates the value. And that deflation drives choices that favor now over later, even when later's better. Exercise. The benefits, health, energy, longevity, are months or years away. The cost, effort, discomfort is now. Temporal discounting makes the immediate cost loom larger than the distant benefit. So you skip the workout. Not because you don't want the benefits, because they're too far out to outweigh the pain of getting started. It's not just individuals. Societies do this. Climate action requires costs now for benefits decades away. Temporal discounting makes those future benefits feel too small to justify present sacrifice. So, action stalls. The future keeps getting discounted, and the problem keeps getting worse. What makes temporal discounting dangerous is that it's invisible. You don't feel like you're undervaluing the future. You feel like you're making reasonable trade-offs. But the trade-offs aren't reasonable. They're biased. You're systematically choosing worse outcomes because your brain can't properly value rewards that aren't immediate. And every time you do, the gap between where you are and where you could have been grows. Attribute substitution. Someone asks how happy you are with your life overall. Big question. Complex. You'd need to think about career, relationships, health, purpose, finances, all of it. But you don't. Instead, your brain substitutes an easier question. How do I feel right now? And you answer based on that. If you're having a good day, you say you're happy with life. If you're having a rough day, you say you're not. The actual question, too hard to answer quickly, gets replaced with something your brain can process immediately. Attribute substitution happens when your mind swaps a difficult question for an easier one without you noticing. You think you're answering the hard question. You're not. You're answering the simple version your brain constructed as a shortcut. It's efficient. Truly evaluating life satisfaction would take hours. You don't have hours, so your brain grabs the closest available proxy, current mood, and runs with it. The problem is, current mood isn't life satisfaction. It's just easier to access. And because the substitution happens automatically, you don't realize you've answered a different question. This shows up everywhere. Someone's deciding whether to hire a candidate. The real question, will this person succeed in the role long-term, is hard. It requires predicting future performance based on limited information. So the brain substitutes. Do I like this person? That's easy to answer. And likability becomes the proxy for competence. They hire based on the easy question, thinking they answered the hard one. Investing. The actual question, is this a good long-term investment, demands analysis. The substitute question, has this been doing well recently, is immediate. So people buy what's been rising, assuming recent performance answers the question of future value. It doesn't, but the brain made the swap before conscious thought could intervene. Relationships. Is this person right for me? Hard question. Requires evaluating compatibility values, long-term fit. The substitute, do I feel good around them right now, is easy. And that feeling, however temporary, becomes the answer to a much bigger question. Attribute substitution doesn't make you lazy. It makes you efficient in ways that backfire. You're answering questions. Just not the ones you think you are. And by the time you realize the substitution happened, you've already committed to the answer. Effect heuristic. How risky is nuclear power? Your answer isn't based on statistics. It's based on how nuclear power makes you feel. If it feels dangerous, you'll say it's high risk. If it feels safe, you'll say it's low risk. The feeling comes first. The justification follows. And what drives the feeling isn't data. It's imagery. Mushroom clouds. Chernobyl. Chernobyl. associations your brain's built over time that have nothing to do with actual probability. The effect heuristic is the tendency to let emotional reactions guide judgments about risk and benefit, rather than evaluating facts. If something feels good, you assume it's low risk and high benefit. If it feels bad, you assume it's high risk and low benefit. The feeling substitutes for analysis. It's fast. Emotions fire instantly. Logic takes time. So when you need a quick judgment, your brain defaults to how something feels. And once the feeling's set, it's hard to override. Even when you're shown data contradicting it, the emotional response lingers. Nuclear power might statistically be safer than coal. But if it feels scarier, that perception dominates. This creates completely irrational patterns. People fear flying but not driving, even though driving's far more dangerous. Why? Why? Flying feels riskier. The lack of control. The height. The imagery of crashes. Driving feels familiar. Safe. The effect, the emotional tone overrides the numbers. You see it in consumer choices. A product with a friendly brand feels higher quality, even when it's not. A company with negative press feels less trustworthy, even if their actual track record's solid. The feeling, positive or negative, becomes the shortcut for evaluating everything else. Quality, safety, value. What makes the effect heuristic dangerous is that it doesn't feel like a shortcut. It feels like insight. You're not aware you're relying on emotion. You think you're making a reasoned judgment. But the reasoning came after the feeling. And the feeling, however inaccurate, is driving the decision. The effect heuristic doesn't eliminate analysis. It just makes sure the conclusion matches how you already feel. And once that match is made, changing your mind becomes nearly impossible. Availability heuristic. Shark attacks. Plane crashes. Terrorist incidents. Ask people how common these are, and they'll overestimate, wildly. Not because they're ignorant, because they're relying on how easily examples come to mind. And dramatic, rare events come to mind easily because they're covered relentlessly. The easier something is to recall, the more common it feels, even when it's statistically insignificant. This is the availability heuristic. Using the ease of recall as a proxy for frequency. If you can think of examples quickly, your brain assumes they happen often. If examples don't come to mind, your brain assumes they're rare. But recall isn't frequency. It's vividness, recency, and media coverage. And those have nothing to do with actual probability. You see this constantly. Someone hears about a burglary in the neighborhood. Suddenly, crime feels rampant. Not because crime increased. Because one vivid example made burglary easy to recall. And ease of recall inflated the perceived risk. Meanwhile, far more common dangers, heart disease, car accidents, get ignored because they're not as vivid or recent. The media amplifies this mercilessly. Rare but dramatic events get saturated coverage. Plane crash. Top story for a week. Thousands of safe flights. Not news. So when you think about air travel, the crash comes to mind instantly. The safe flights don't. And your brain, using availability as the shortcut, concludes flying's dangerous. It affects decisions across the board. Hiring. If you recently interviewed someone who was overconfident and it went badly, you'll be biased against confident candidates. Not because confidence predicts failure. Because one recent, vivid example made the connection easy to recall. Investments. If you remember a friend losing money in a particular sector, you'll avoid that sector, even if it's statistically sound. What makes the availability heuristic insidious is that it operates invisibly. You don't think, I'm judging this based on what I can remember easily. You think, I'm judging this based on how common it is. But you're not. You're judging based on what your memory surfaces first. And memory prioritizes drama, not data. The availability heuristic doesn't make you misinformed. It makes you miscalibrated. You overact to vivid risks and underact to common ones. And the gap between what feels dangerous and what actually is keeps widening. Representativeness Heuristic. You meet someone. Quiet. Reads a lot. Prefers small gatherings. You're asked, are they more likely to be a librarian or a salesperson? You say librarian. Makes sense. They fit the stereotype. But statistically, there are far more salespeople than librarians. So even if the description fits a librarian better, the odds still favor salesperson. Your brain ignored the base rates, how common each profession is, and focused entirely on how well the person matched the stereotype. The representativeness heuristic is judging probability based on how much something resembles a typical case, rather than considering actual statistical likelihood. If it looks like the category, your brain assumes it belongs to the category, even when the numbers say otherwise. It's intuitive. Stereotypes exist because they capture patterns. Quiet, bookish types do become librarians more often than loud extroverts do. But that doesn't mean every quiet, bookish person is a librarian. The match feels strong, so your brain treats it as certainty. And in doing so, it ignores the crucial fact that salespeople vastly outnumber librarians. Representativeness overrode base rates. This creates systematic errors. Someone's told a person is successful, driven, and works long hours. Are they more likely to be an entrepreneur or a middle manager? Most people say entrepreneur. But there are far more middle managers. The description fits the entrepreneurial stereotype better, so it feels more likely. But likely and representative aren't the same thing. Investing. A company's had 5 profitable quarters in a row. Investors assume it's a strong performer. But 5 quarters is a small sample. Representativeness makes the streak feel meaningful, like it represents the company's true quality, when it could easily be luck. The pattern fits the stereotype of a good investment, so people buy, ignoring that short streaks don't predict long-term performance. Judging people. Someone makes one generous gesture. You assume they're a generous person. One generous act fits the representative image of generosity, so your brain extrapolates. But one action isn't a personality. It's a data point. Representativeness made you treat it as a pattern. The representativeness heuristic doesn't make you trust stereotypes blindly. It makes you trust resemblance more than you should. And resemblance, however strong, isn't the same as probability. Information overload. You're researching a decision, buying a car, choosing a health plan, picking a university. You want to be thorough, so you read everything. Reviews, comparisons, expert opinions, user forums, data sheets. Hours in, you're not more certain. You're less certain. The information didn't clarify. It buried you. And now, instead of making a choice, you're paralyzed by the sheer volume of conflicting details you can't reconcile. Information overload happens when the amount of available information exceeds your capacity to process it effectively. More data doesn't lead to better decisions. Past a certain point, it leads to worse ones. Because your brain can't hold it all, can't weigh it all, and eventually stops trying. The problem isn't the information itself. It's the illusion that more equals better. You assume if you just read one more review, compare one more option, dig one more layer deep, clarity will emerge. It doesn't. Each new piece of information adds complexity. And complexity, beyond a threshold, becomes noise. What happens next is predictable. You start forgetting what you read earlier. The comparisons blur. You can't remember which option had which feature. So you reread. But rereading doesn't help because you're still overloaded. The sheer volume has exceeded your working memory. And instead of narrowing down, you're stuck in a loop, consuming information without processing it. Decision quality tanks. Studies show that people make worse choices when given too much information than when given just enough. Because just enough allows comparison. Too much triggers avoidance. You defer. You second guess. Or you make a random choice just to escape the overload, then regret it later because you never actually processed the information you spent hours gathering. It's not just purchases. Career paths. Endless research into industries, roles, companies. The more you read, the less clear the path becomes. Relationships. Overanalyzing every interaction, every text, every subtle shift. The information doesn't clarify feelings. It obscures them. Information overload doesn't make you informed. It makes you confused. And confusion, dressed up as thoroughness, keeps you stuck long after the information stopped being useful. Analysis paralysis. You've done the research. You've compared the options. You understand the trade-offs. And still you can't decide. Not because the choice is genuinely difficult, but because the act of analyzing has become a substitute for deciding. You've thought about it so much that action feels impossible. Every option has flaws. Every path has risks. And the more you analyze, the clearer those flaws become until no choice feels right. Analysis paralysis happens when overthinking a decision prevents you from making it. The analysis doesn't clarify it. It magnifies doubt. And doubt, once magnified, makes commitment feel reckless. It starts reasonably. You want to make a good choice. So you think it through. You list pros and cons. You consider outcomes. But somewhere in that process, the analysis stops being helpful and starts being a defense mechanism. Because as long as you're still analyzing, you don't have to commit. And commitment means accepting the possibility of being wrong. The longer the analysis runs, the worse it gets. You start imagining edge cases. Hypothetical scenarios. What if this happens? What if that doesn't? The decision, which initially had clear contours, becomes a tangled web of possibilities. And navigating that web feels harder than the actual consequences of choosing poorly. Jobs. You've got an offer. Good role. Decent pay. Solid team. But you keep analyzing. What if the company's culture isn't what it seems? What if a better offer comes next month? What if you hate the commute after a year? None of these are unreasonable concerns. But they're not decision makers. They're stall tactics. And while you're analyzing, the offer expires. Relationships. You've been dating someone for months. Things are good. But you can't commit because you keep analyzing. Are they really the one? What if someone better comes along? What if this feeling fades? The analysis doesn't protect you from a bad choice. It protects you from making any choice. And in doing so, it makes the choice for you. By waiting, you lose the option to choose. Analysis paralysis doesn't mean you're indecisive. It means you've mistaken thinking for progress. And the longer you think without acting, the more stuck you become. Decision avoidance. The forms sitting on your desk. Health insurance. You need to pick a plan. It's been there for 2 weeks. Every time you look at it, you tell yourself you'll deal with it later. You're not procrastinating because you're lazy. You're avoiding it because choosing feels overwhelming. Too many options. Too many variables. Too much risk of picking wrong. So instead of deciding, you do nothing. And doing nothing becomes the choice you make by default. Decision avoidance is the active refusal to make a choice, even when choosing is necessary. It's not indecision, it's avoidance. The difference is intent. Indecision is wanting to choose but struggling to commit. Avoidance is not wanting to choose at all. The trigger is usually complexity or consequence. When a decision feels too hard, too important, or too uncertain, avoidance becomes the escape. You're not weighing options. You're avoiding the weight entirely. And the longer you avoid, the easier avoidance becomes, because now there's also the discomfort of having delayed, which makes facing the choice feel even worse. This shows up everywhere. Career changes. You know your current role isn't working. But exploring alternatives means confronting uncertainty. What if you don't find something better? What if you make the wrong move? So you avoid the decision entirely. You stay not because staying's right, but because leaving requires choosing a direction, and choosing a direction feels impossible. Relationships. Something's not working. You need to address it. But addressing it means deciding what to do, how to say it, what outcome you want. That's hard. So you avoid the conversation. Days turn into weeks. Weeks into months. And the problem you avoided deciding about has now decided for you. What makes decision avoidance cruel is that it doesn't eliminate the decision. It just removes your control over it. While you're avoiding, circumstances are choosing. The deadline passes. The opportunity closes. The relationship deteriorates. And by the time you're ready to decide, the choice has already been made. Just not by you. Choice deferral. Later. You'll decide later. Not now, but soon. The job offer can wait another day. The investment decision can sit until next week. The conversation can happen after the weekend. There's always a reason to delay. You're busy. You're tired. You want to think it through more carefully. But the delay isn't strategic. It's habitual. And every time you defer, the choice becomes harder to make. Choice deferral is postponing a decision without a clear reason, driven by the discomfort of committing now. It's not the same as gathering information. That's purposeful delay. Deferral is delay as avoidance. You're not waiting for clarity. You're waiting for the decision to feel easier, and it never does. The psychology is simple. Making a choice now means accepting responsibility now. Deferring means you can avoid that wait a little longer. Tomorrow you will handle it. Tomorrow you is always more capable, more certain, more ready. Except when tomorrow arrives, it's today again. And today you still doesn't want to decide. What's insidious is that deferral feels reasonable. You're not avoiding the choice. You're being thoughtful, careful. But thoughtful would mean using the delay productively. Deferral doesn't. You defer, then do nothing with the extra time. The information you could have gathered doesn't get gathered. The clarity you hoped would arrive doesn't come. You're just as uncertain a week later. The only thing that's changed is the deadline's closer. This plays out constantly. Purchases. You see something you want. You defer. I'll think about it. Come back tomorrow. But tomorrow you're still uncertain. So you defer again. Eventually, you either buy it impulsively out of frustration or walk away having wasted days on a decision that didn't need them. Health decisions. You notice a symptom. You should see a doctor. But you defer. It's probably nothing. You'll wait and see. Weeks pass. The symptom persists. You defer again. Now it's become a pattern. And by the time you finally act, what could have been addressed early has progressed. Choice deferral doesn't buy you better decisions. It just trades present discomfort for future regret. And the longer you defer, the more the cost of deferring accumulates. Anticipated regret. You're standing at a crossroads. Two options. One's safe. One's uncertain. The safe choice probably won't lead to regret. The uncertain one might. And that possibility that you could look back and wish you'd chosen differently weighs so heavily that it tilts the entire decision. You're not choosing based on outcomes. You're choosing based on which future regret you're more willing to risk. Anticipated regret is when the fear of future regret, rather than the actual consequences of a choice, drives the decision. You're not evaluating which option leads to the best result. You're evaluating which option makes regret feel less likely. The problem is that regret comes in two forms: action regret and inaction regret, and they don't weigh the same. Doing something and having it fail feels worse in the short term, but not doing something and wondering what could have been tends to haunt longer. So when you choose based on anticipated regret, you're often choosing to avoid the sharper immediate pain, even when it means accepting the duller, longer-lasting one. Someone's offered a new opportunity. Higher risk, higher potential reward. They decline. Not because the opportunity's bad, Because if they take it and it fails, they'll regret the decision. That regret feels vivid. Easy to imagine. So they stay where they are. But years later, the regret isn't about the decision they made. It's about the decision they didn't make. The path they never tried. Relationships. You're considering ending things. But what if you regret it? What if you realize later they were right for you? That anticipated regret keeps you in. But staying also has regret attacked. The time you spend in something that isn't working. The growth you miss. The connections you don't make. One regret feels immediate. The other accumulates slowly. And by focusing on the immediate one, you walk straight into the delayed one. Anticipated regret doesn't prevent regret. It just makes you choose which type you'll carry. And because you can't predict the future, you end up choosing based on which regret's easier to imagine, not which outcome's actually better. Preference construction. Ask someone what they want. They'll tell you. Confident. Clear. Clear. But change the context and their answer changes. Not because they were lying, because their preferences weren't fixed. They were constructed in the moment based on how the question was framed, what options were presented, and what felt salient right then. Preference construction is the process by which preferences are built during the decision, rather than retrieved from some stable internal set of values. You don't have a pre-existing answer sitting in your mind waiting to be accessed. You construct the answer on the spot. And that construction depends heavily on context. It's unsettling because it contradicts how we think about ourselves. You assume you know what you want, that your preferences are consistent. But they're not. They shift based on how options are described, what you're comparing them to, and even your mood at the time of choosing. Someone's choosing between two flats. In isolation, they prefer the one with more space. But if you show them a third option, tiny and overpriced, suddenly the medium-sized flat looks better. Their preference wasn't for space. It was constructed relative to what they were comparing. Change the comparison, and the preference changes. You see this in everyday choices. Restaurants. If you're choosing from a short menu, you pick based on what sounds good. If you're choosing from a long menu, you pick based on what's not overwhelming. Same person. Different preference. Not because your tastes changed, but because the decision context shaped what felt appealing. Career paths. Ask someone what matters most in a job, salary or fulfillment. Their answer will depend on what they're currently lacking. If they're broke, salary. If they're burned out, fulfillment. The preference isn't stable. It's constructed based on present circumstances. And those circumstances shift. Preference construction doesn't mean you're inconsistent. It means your preferences are context dependent. And if they're context dependent, the idea that you can simply know what you want becomes far more complicated. Because what you want isn't a fixed thing. It's something you build each time you choose from whatever's in front of you at that moment. Reference dependence. You get a raise. 5%. Are you happy? Depends. If your colleague got 3%, 5 feels generous. If your colleague got 10%, 5 feels insulting. Same raise. Same money in your account. But your reaction isn't based on the absolute amount. It's based on the comparison. The reference point, what you're measuring against, determines how the outcome feels. Reference dependence is the principle that value isn't absolute. It's relative to a reference point. And that reference point, what you're comparing to, shapes whether something feels like a gain or a loss, a success or a failure, fair or unfair. It's why £100 bonus feels great if you weren't expecting anything, but disappointing if you were expecting 200. The money's the same. But the reference, your expectation, changed how it registered. Against no bonus, 100's a win. Against 200, it's a loss. The brain doesn't evaluate the 100 in isolation. It evaluates it against the reference. This drives decisions constantly. Investments. A stock drops 10%. Do you sell? Depends on your reference point. If you bought it recently, 10% down feels like a loss. If you bought it years ago and it's up overall, 10% down feels like profit-taking. Same stock. Same drop. Different decision, because the reference point, your entry price, determines whether the move feels good or bad. Salaries. You're earning 50,000. You're offered 55 at a new company. Sounds good. But if your current role just rejected your request for 60, 55 now feels like settling. The reference, what you were aiming for, changed how the offer landed. Same 55,000. Different reaction. What makes reference dependence tricky is that reference points are arbitrary. They're set by expectations, comparisons, past experiences, random anchors. But once set, they feel real. And they dictate how every outcome after that gets interpreted. You're not evaluating the thing itself. You're evaluating it against a reference that might have no logical basis. But it doesn't matter. The reference shapes the feeling. And the feeling drives the choice. Decision conflict. Two good options. Both appealing. Both viable. You can only pick one. And the moment you start comparing them, stress kicks in. It's not that either choice is bad. It's that choosing one means losing the other. And that loss, even though you're gaining something, feels painful. The conflict between what you want and what you're giving up creates a paralysis that shouldn't exist. Because logically, having two good options is better than having none. But psychologically, it's torture. Decision conflict is the psychological tension that arises when you're torn between options that are roughly equal in attractiveness. The conflict doesn't come from difficulty evaluating them. It comes from the emotional cost of sacrifice. Choosing means losing. And even when what you're losing is something you never had, it still hurts. The brain hates trade-offs. It wants clear winners. When one option is obviously better, choosing's easy. But when both are good, just differently good, the choice forces you to confront what you're giving up. And focusing on what you're giving up makes the chosen option feel less satisfying, even before you've experienced it. Job offers. Two solid roles. One's better pay. One's better culture. You can't have both. So you're stuck weighing salary against environment, future growth against present comfort. The conflict isn't that one's wrong. It's that picking one means accepting you'll never know what the other would have been like. And that uncertainty feeds the conflict. Relationships. Early dating. Two people. Both interesting. Both compatible in different ways. Choosing one means closing the door on the other. And even though you didn't know either well enough to be a take, the act of choosing creates regret for the path you're not taking. The conflict isn't about who's better. It's about the discomfort of foreclosing possibility. What makes decision conflict exhausting is that it doesn't resolve when you choose. It lingers. You pick one option, but you keep thinking about the other. Did you choose right? What would have happened if you'd gone the other way? The conflict, rather than ending, morphs into doubt. And that doubt undermines your satisfaction with the choice you made. Decision conflict doesn't mean you're indecisive. It means you're human. And being human means every choice comes with the ghost of what you didn't choose.